What happened next will leave you speechless. Make sure to like, share, and comment below where you're listening from. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Daniel Rhodes stepped out of his small brick house, clutching a worn military duffel bag against his chest like it contained his very soul. At 62, his weathered hands trembled slightly as he locked the front door, the same ritual he'd performed every day for the past 20 years since retiring from active duty. But today was different. Today, the bag would finally leave his house for the first time in 2 decades. Daniel's neighbors had grown accustomed to seeing him in his front yard, tending to a small vegetable garden that never seemed to produce much. They had waved politely, exchanged pleasantries about the weather, but none of them really knew the man who lived behind those quiet eyes. Sarah Mitchell from next door had tried countless times to invite him over for Sunday dinner, but Daniel always declined with the same gentle smile and excuse about having other plans. The truth was, Daniel Rhodes had been planning the same thing every Sunday for 20 years. Sitting in his living room, staring at that duffel bag, and trying to find the courage to open it. The bag itself was unremarkable to most people who might catch a glimpse of it through his window. Faded olive green canvas, worn at the corners, with patches of fabric that had been mended more times than Daniel cared to count. But to him, it wasn't just a bag. It was a time capsule, a vault of memories so painful that the very thought of unzipping it made his chest tighten and his breathing shallow. The weight of it, not just physical, but emotional, had been his constant companion through sleepless nights and anxiety-filled days. This particular morning felt different because of a single piece of mail that had arrived 3 days earlier. The envelope bore the letterhead of Jefferson Elementary School, and inside was an invitation that had initially made Daniel's hands shake so violently he'd dropped it twice before managing to read it completely. The school was hosting their annual Veterans Day ceremony, and they specifically requested his presence as one of the community's most decorated soldiers. The letter mentioned that children would be presenting handmade cards and gifts to honor local veterans, and that the entire community was invited to witness this special tribute. Daniel had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and commanded respect from every soldier who'd served under him. But the thought of standing in front of a room full of children, being called a hero, made him feel like the greatest fraud who'd ever lived. How could he accept their gratitude when he carried such weight in his chest, such secrets in his bag, such guilt in his heart, that some nights he couldn't even look at himself in the mirror? But something about the innocence in the teacher's words, the way she'd written about how much it would mean to the children to meet a real hero, had broken through his usual defenses. Maybe it was time. Maybe after 20 years of hiding, of carrying this burden alone, it was finally time to step back into the world. The bag would come with him. It always did. But perhaps being around children, seeing their untainted view of service and sacrifice, might help him remember who he used to be before Kandahar changed everything. As Daniel walked the 6 blocks to Jefferson Elementary, his grip on the bag's handles never loosened. Every step felt like walking through quicksand, each breath a conscious effort. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and he could hear the distant sounds of children playing in the schoolyard. Their laughter drifted toward him like a melody from another lifetime, back when the world seemed simpler, when right and wrong had clearer boundaries, when sleep came easily and dreams weren't filled with smoke and screaming. The school building appeared before him, a modest 2-story structure with red brick walls and large windows that reflected the morning sun. American flags flanked the main entrance, hanging still in the windless air. Daniel paused at the edge of the school property, watching as other veterans began to arrive. He recognized a few faces, men from his father's generation, who'd served in Vietnam, younger veterans from Iraq who still carried themselves with military bearing. They all looked comfortable, proud even, adjusting their dress uniforms and chatting easily with family members who'd come to support them. Daniel looked down at his own clothes, a simple button-down shirt, clean but unremarkable, and dress pants he'd bought specifically for this occasion, because nothing in his closet seemed appropriate for being called a hero. The bag felt heavier with each passing moment, and he found himself questioning whether he should turn around and go home. But then he heard his name being called. Mr. Rhodes, you made it!" The voice belonged to Mrs. Patterson, the 3rd-grade teacher who had written the invitation. She was younger than he had expected, probably in her 30s, with kind eyes and an energy that seemed to light up the space around her. She hurried toward him across the parking lot, her heels clicking against the asphalt, and Daniel noticed how her face genuinely brightened when she saw him. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, slightly out of breath. "The children have been so excited ever since I told them we might have a real Afghanistan veteran joining us today. They've prepared something very special." Daniel's throat felt dry as he managed to respond. "I hope I don't disappoint them." "Are you kidding?" Mrs. Patterson's laugh was warm and genuine. "Just you being here means everything. Come on, let me show you where we'll be set up." As they walked toward the school entrance, Daniel became acutely aware of the bag in his hand, and how Mrs. Patterson's eyes kept glancing toward it. He'd grown so accustomed to carrying it that he sometimes forgot how unusual it might look to others. A man his age, dressed for a formal ceremony, carrying what appeared to be military surplus equipment, like he was heading on deployment rather than to an elementary school assembly. "That's quite a bag," Mrs. Patterson commented conversationally. "Looks like it has some history." Daniel's steps faltered slightly, his grip tightening unconsciously. "Old habits," he managed. "Hard to break." She seemed to sense something in his tone because she didn't press further, instead launching into details about the ceremony. 23 students had prepared presentations, she explained, and the local newspaper was sending a photographer. The mayor would be speaking, and they'd arranged for light refreshments afterward so the veterans could mingle with families and share stories with the children. As they entered the school building, Daniel was struck by how different it felt from the military installations he was used to. The walls were covered with colorful artwork, children's handwriting on construction paper, photos from field trips and school events. Everything was bright, cheerful, alive with the kind of innocence he'd forgotten existed in the world. The hallways smelled like cleaning supplies and lunch preparations, not diesel fuel and desert sand. It should have been comforting, but instead it made the weight of his bag feel even more pronounced, like he was bringing something dark into a place that deserved only light. The gymnasium had been transformed for the ceremony. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a small stage area with a podium decorated with red, white, and blue bunting, and along the walls, dozens of poster-sized drawings that the children had created to honor veterans. Daniel found himself stopping in front of one particular drawing, a crayon illustration of a soldier kneeling beside a small figure, both surrounded by what appeared to be mountains and a bright yellow sun. The title, written in careful third-grade handwriting, read, "Heroes Save People." Something twisted in Daniel's chest as he stared at that innocent artwork. The child who'd drawn it had no idea how complicated the truth could be, how sometimes the people you tried to save couldn't be saved, how sometimes the act of trying to be a hero left you questioning whether you deserved the title at all. His fingers tightened around the bag's handles until his knuckles went white. "Mr. Rhodes," Mrs. Patterson had returned to his side. "Are you all right?" "Fine," he said quickly, forcing himself to look away from the drawing. "Just taking it all in." Other veterans had begun to take their seats in the front row, and Daniel noticed how easily they seemed to settle into the moment. They chatted with each other, laughed at shared memories, accepted the handshakes and thanks from parents and school staff with gracious smiles. Daniel took his assigned seat at the end of the row, the bag positioned carefully between his feet, and tried to blend into the background. But as the gymnasium began to fill with families, Daniel became aware that blending in might not be possible. Children kept pointing in his direction, whispering to their parents, and he could hear fragments of conversations about the quiet veteran with the bag, and, "I wonder what he carries in there." The attention made him want to disappear, to take his bag and walk out before the ceremony even began. That's when he saw her. A little girl, probably 5 or 6 years old, had broken away from her family and was walking directly toward him. She had dark hair pulled back in pigtails and was wearing a red dress with white flowers. In her small hands, she carried a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been handled carefully but frequently. Her eyes were fixed on Daniel with the kind of direct, unguarded curiosity that only children possess. "Are you a soldier?" she asked, stopping directly in front of his chair. Daniel felt every eye in the nearby area turn toward them. His mouth went dry, but something about her innocent question, asked without fear or judgment, made him lean forward slightly. "I was," he answered quietly, "a long time ago." "My teacher said soldiers are brave," she continued, then glanced down at the bag beside his feet. "Is that your soldier bag?" The simple question hit Daniel like a physical blow. In her world, it was just a soldier bag, not a repository of guilt and regret, not a vessel carrying 20 years of suppressed trauma. just equipment that belonged to someone who used to be brave. He found himself nodding. "My name's Lucy," she said, unfolding the paper in her hands. "I drew you a picture." Before Daniel could respond, she thrust the drawing toward him. It was another crayon creation, this one showing a figure in green standing next to what appeared to be a helicopter, with stick figures of children in the background. At the bottom, in purple crayon, she'd written, "Thank you for keeping us safe." Daniel took the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. He stared at it for a long moment, seeing not just Lucy's innocent artwork, but every child he'd encountered during his service, every face that had looked at him with hope or fear or desperate need. When he looked back up, Lucy was watching him with patient expectation. "It's beautiful," he managed. "Thank you." "My grandpa was a soldier too," Lucy said, apparently encouraged by his response. "But he went to heaven before I was born. Mommy says he would have liked your bag." The words were spoken with such casual innocence that Daniel almost missed their deeper meaning. But as Lucy skipped back to her family, waving goodbye over her shoulder, he found himself wondering what her grandfather might have carried, what memories and regrets might have shaped his later years, whether he had found peace with whatever choices he'd made in service. The ceremony was about to begin, and Mrs. Patterson was approaching the podium to welcome everyone. Daniel folded Lucy's drawing carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. For the first time in 20 years, the bag beside his feet felt less like a burden and more like a companion. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today, surrounded by the innocent gratitude of children and the understanding nods of fellow veterans, he might finally find the courage to confront what he'd been carrying all these years. But as the first speaker took the stage and began talking about honor and service and sacrifice, Daniel had no idea that within the next hour, his carefully guarded secret would be exposed in a way he never could have imagined. The bag that had been his private burden for 2 decades was about to become the center of attention in a way that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone in that gymnasium. The sound of a door opening at the back of the room caught Daniel's attention, and he turned to see what appeared to be additional security arriving. 2 uniformed officers entered, followed by a handler with a German shepherd that Daniel immediately recognized as a canine unit. The dog moved with the confident, alert bearing of a working animal, its ears pricked forward and nose already sampling the air for any scent that might require investigation. Daniel's blood ran cold. His grip on the bag tightened involuntarily as he watched the canine team make their way along the perimeter of the gymnasium. This wasn't part of the planned ceremony. He was certain of that. Mrs. Patterson looked surprised too, glancing toward the principal with raised eyebrows. But the dog handler seemed to be conducting a routine security sweep, probably standard procedure for any public event these days. The German shepherd, a magnificent animal with intelligent dark eyes, was working methodically through the crowd, occasionally pausing to investigate a backpack or purse before moving on with a satisfied sniff. Daniel tried to focus on the speech being given at the podium, something about the sacrifices made by the greatest generation, but his attention kept drifting to the approaching K9 team. 20 feet away, 15 feet, 10 feet. The dog stopped, its head snapped up, nose working the air with sudden intensity. The handler, a young officer named Martinez according to his name tag, noticed the change in his partner's behavior immediately. The German shepherd's entire body language shifted from casual investigation to focused alertness, and Daniel felt sweat beginning to form at the back of his neck. 5 feet away, the dog locked onto Daniel's position with unmistakable certainty. Its nose pointed directly at the bag sitting beside Daniel's chair, and a low, rumbling growl began to emanate from deep in its chest. The sound was quiet enough that most of the audience didn't notice, but every veteran in the front row turned to look, their own military training making them instantly alert to potential danger. "Ranger, what is it?" Officer Martinez whispered, but the dog's focus never wavered from Daniel's bag. The growl grew slightly louder, and now heads throughout the gymnasium were beginning to turn. Mrs. Patterson stopped mid-sentence at the podium, her eyes wide as she took in the scene developing in the front row. Parents began pulling their children closer, instinctive protective responses kicking in even though they didn't understand what was happening. Daniel sat frozen, his heart pounding so hard he was certain everyone around him could hear it. The bag that had been his private companion for 20 years was suddenly the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Ranger's growl was steady now, not aggressive exactly, but clearly indicating that something about Daniel's bag required investigation. "Sir," Officer Martinez said quietly, stepping closer to Daniel's chair, "I'm going to need you to remain calm. My partner seems to have detected something concerning about your bag." The words hit the gymnasium like a bomb going off in slow motion. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Children's chatter died away, and even the youngest attendees seemed to sense that something serious was happening. Daniel looked around and saw fear beginning to creep into the faces surrounding him. Parents calculating the distance to exits, teachers moving protectively toward their students, fellow veterans watching with the alert wariness of men who'd seen real danger. "There's nothing dangerous in there," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. But even as he spoke the words, he realized how they sounded. How many times had security teams heard those exact words from people who were lying? Ranger's behavior was becoming more pronounced. The dog was now sitting directly in front of Daniel's chair, its intense gaze fixed on the bag, occasionally whining softly between growls. Whatever scent the animal was detecting, it was strong enough to override its training to remain quiet during investigations. "I understand, sir," Officer Martinez replied, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm going to need you to slowly place the bag on the floor and step away from it. This is just a precaution." The gymnasium was now completely silent, except for the sound of Ranger's continued alertness and the whispered conversations of parents trying to explain to their children what was happening. Daniel could feel dozens of eyes on him, could see the fear and suspicion beginning to replace the gratitude and respect that had filled the room just moments earlier. Mrs. Patterson approached cautiously from the stage area. "Mr. Rhodes, is everything all right? Maybe we should move the ceremony to—" "No," Daniel interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "The children shouldn't have their ceremony ruined because of me." But as he looked around the room, he realized it was too late for that. Lucy, the little girl who had given him the drawing, was now pressed against her mother's side, her wide eyes darting between Daniel and the growling dog. The innocent trust she'd shown him just minutes earlier had been replaced by confusion and fear. "Sir, I need you to comply with the officer's request," Principal Walker had approached from the other side, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to managing crisis situations. "For the safety of everyone here, including the children." Daniel's hands shook as he looked down at the bag that had been his constant companion for 20 years. The idea of letting strangers examine it, of having its contents exposed in front of all these people, made him feel like he was being asked to strip naked in public. But Ranger's continued agitation was making it clear that he didn't have a choice. "I haven't opened this bag," Daniel said quietly, his words carrying further in the silent gymnasium than he'd intended. "In 20 years. The admission sent a ripple of whispers through the crowd. 20 years? What could someone carry for 20 years without opening? The speculation was visible on every face, and Daniel could practically hear the theories being formed. Weapons, explosives, evidence of crimes. The possibilities were as endless as they were damaging to any chance he had of maintaining his privacy. Officer Martinez was now speaking quietly into his radio, calling for backup, and possibly a bomb squad. The words were barely audible, but Daniel caught enough to understand that the situation was escalating beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd decided to attend the ceremony. "Please," Daniel said, his voice carrying a desperation that surprised even him. "I know how this looks, but I'm not a threat to anyone here. I would never put children in danger." "Then help us understand what we're dealing with," Principal Walker replied. "What's in the bag that's causing this reaction?" This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. The bag was supposed to remain his private burden, his personal penance for choices made and lives that couldn't be saved. It was never supposed to become a public spectacle, never supposed to frighten children or disrupt a ceremony meant to honor service and sacrifice. But Ranger's continued focus on the bag was making it clear that the choice was no longer his to make. Whatever secrets he'd been carrying were about to be exposed, whether he was ready or not. And as he looked around the gymnasium at all the frightened, curious, suspicious faces watching his every move, Daniel realized that his 20 years of hiding were finally coming to an end. The silence in the gymnasium stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Officer Martinez's backup had arrived, 2 additional uniformed officers who positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter while keeping their distance from the increasingly agitated German shepherd. Ranger hadn't moved from his position in front of Daniel's chair, his intense focus on the worn duffel bag unwavering, despite his handler's repeated attempts to redirect his attention. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time," Officer Martinez said, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the tension radiating from everyone in the room. "Please place the bag on the floor and step away from it slowly." Daniel's throat felt like sandpaper as he looked down at the bag that had been welded to his side for 2 decades. His fingers, weathered and scarred from years of military service, trembled as they gripped the canvas handles. The weight of it, 3 pounds of fabric and contents, but somehow carrying the gravitational pull of his entire adult life, seemed to anchor him to the folding chair like an emotional tether. "You don't understand," Daniel whispered, his words barely audible but somehow carrying across the silent gymnasium. "I made a promise." Mrs. Patterson, who had remained near the podium despite the principal's subtle gestures for her to move the children to safety, took a cautious step forward. Her teacher's instincts were warring with common sense. Every fiber of her being wanted to protect her students, but something in Daniel's voice, something broken and desperate, made her hesitate. "What kind of promise, Mr. Rhodes?" she asked gently. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and meaningful. Daniel could feel the weight of every eye in the room, could sense the phones being quietly pulled from pockets as parents prepared to document whatever was about to unfold. But it was Lucy's face that caught his attention. The little girl who had given him the drawing was still pressed against her mother's side, but her eyes held something different now. Not fear exactly, but a kind of patient curiosity that reminded him of someone else, someone from a long time ago. "I promised I would never let it go," Daniel said, his voice growing stronger. "I promised I would carry it until I could make things right." Ranger's whining had taken on a different quality now, less aggressive and more insistent. The dog's tail was moving slightly, not quite wagging, but no longer rigid with alertness. Officer Martinez noticed the change immediately. In his 5 years working with canine units, he'd learned to read his partner's subtle communications like a foreign language. "Ranger's behavior is changing," he reported quietly into his radio, still focused on the bag, but the aggression indicators are decreasing. Principal Walker approached from the side, his hands raised in a gesture meant to be calming. "Mr. Rhodes, whatever promise you made, I'm sure we can work through this together, but right now, we need to ensure everyone's safety." "The bag isn't dangerous," Daniel said, finally looking up from the worn canvas to meet the principal's eyes. "Not in the way you think, but it's..." He struggled for words that could explain 20 years of carrying guilt and memory without sounding completely insane. "It's all I have left of him." "Him?" Mrs. Patterson asked, taking another small step closer, despite every safety protocol screaming at her to maintain distance. Daniel's hands loosened slightly on the bag's handles. For 20 years, he'd never spoken about the contents to another living soul. The secret had eaten at him like acid, had kept him awake more nights than he could count, had been the reason he'd declined every dinner invitation and avoided every social gathering. But sitting here, surrounded by children and fellow veterans and ordinary people living ordinary lives, the weight of carrying it alone suddenly felt unbearable. "His name was Carter," Daniel said, and the words felt like breaking a dam that had held for 2 decades. "Carter Williams. He was 19 years old, and he died saving my life." The gymnasium seemed to exhale collectively, the tension shifting from immediate physical danger to something deeper and more complex. Ranger's posture relaxed noticeably, though his attention remained fixed on the bag with an intensity that suggested he was detecting something his human counterparts couldn't understand. Officer Martinez made a decision that would later be questioned by his superiors, but would prove to be exactly right in the moment. Instead of continuing to treat the situation as a potential threat, he crouched down beside his partner and began to study the dog's behavior more carefully. "Ranger's not indicating explosive materials," he said, his professional assessment carrying across the quiet room. "His body language suggests he's detecting something familiar, something that's triggering a memory response rather than a threat response." "What do you mean?" Principal Walker asked. "Military working dogs form strong scent associations," Martinez explained, his hand resting gently on Ranger's head. "If there's something in that bag that carries the scent of someone Ranger knew or worked with, it could explain this reaction." Daniel's eyes widened as the officer's words sank in. "Carter worked with canine units," he said slowly. "He was a dog handler in Kandahar. His partner was a German shepherd named..." Daniel's voice caught as the memory surfaced. "Named King." The connection hit everyone in the room simultaneously. Ranger's reaction wasn't about danger, It was about recognition. Somehow, after 20 years, the dog was detecting traces of a scent that connected him to the military working dog community, to handlers and partners who had served and sacrificed in ways that civilians could barely comprehend. Mrs. Patterson had tears in her eyes as she looked from Daniel to the dog and back again. "The bag has something of Carter's in it?" Daniel nodded, his own eyes beginning to water. "Everything I could save, everything I could carry." The atmosphere in the gymnasium had shifted completely. What had begun as a security threat was revealing itself to be something far more profound, a story of loss and loyalty and the impossible weight of survivors' guilt. Parents who had been edging toward exits were now leaning in, sensing they were witnessing something important, something that went beyond their initial fears. "Why haven't you opened it?" asked Tom Richardson, one of the Vietnam veterans sitting in the front row. His question carried the weight of someone who understood the complexity of carrying wartime memories. Daniel's grip on the bag tightened again, but this time it wasn't possessive fear. It was the grip of someone holding on to the last connection to a fallen friend. "Because once I open it, once I see what's inside, it becomes real. Carter really is gone. The war really is over, and I have to figure out how to live with what happened." The words hung in the air like a confession, raw and honest, in a way that made everyone in the room understand they were witnessing something deeply personal, being shared with strangers who had accidentally become witnesses to a moment of truth. Lucy, the little girl who had given Daniel the drawing, slipped away from her mother's protective embrace and began walking toward the front of the room. Her mother reached for her, but Lucy's 5-year-old determination was stronger than adult caution. She approached Daniel's chair with the same fearless curiosity she'd shown earlier, but now her expression held something that looked remarkably like understanding. "Is Carter in heaven with my grandpa?" she asked, her small voice carrying clearly in the hushed gymnasium. The question, asked with such innocent directness, seemed to break something loose in Daniel's chest. He looked down at this tiny girl who somehow understood what the adults around her were still trying to process, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt like someone was seeing him clearly. "Yes," he whispered. "I think he is." Lucy nodded solemnly, then did something that surprised everyone in the room. She reached out and gently placed her small hand on top of Daniel's weathered fingers, where they gripped the bag's handles. "Maybe it's time to see what Carter wanted you to remember," she said. The simplicity of her words, the lack of judgment or fear, the pure acceptance of a child who hadn't yet learned that some doors were too painful to open, created a moment of clarity that cut through 20 years of Daniel's carefully constructed defenses. Ranger had risen from his sitting position and was now approaching Daniel's chair with a different energy entirely. His tail was wagging slightly, and when he reached the bag, instead of growling, he gently nuzzled it with his nose before looking up at Daniel with what could only be described as encouragement. "I think," Officer Martinez said quietly, "that Ranger is trying to tell you something." Daniel looked around the gymnasium at all the faces watching him, children who didn't understand the complexity of war, but understood the simple truth of grief, parents who were thinking about their own losses and regrets, fellow veterans who recognized the particular weight he'd been carrying, and teachers who spent their lives helping people learn difficult truths about themselves and the world. "If I open it," Daniel said, his voice barely steady, "there's no going back." "There's no going back anyway," said Tom Richardson gently. "There never was." Mrs. Patterson approached slowly, her teacher's instincts recognizing a moment when someone needed support rather than pressure. "Mr. Rhodes, whatever's in that bag, you don't have to face it alone. We're all here with you." The offer of companionship from a room full of strangers should have felt invasive, but instead it felt like something Daniel hadn't experienced in 20 years. Community. The realization that he didn't have to carry his burden in isolation anymore was both terrifying and liberating. Daniel's hands moved to the zipper of the duffel bag for the first time since 2005. The metal was tarnished and stiff from disuse, and it took considerable effort to begin pulling it open. The sound it made, a slow, reluctant grinding, seemed to echo in the silent gymnasium like the opening of a tomb. As the zipper moved inch by inch, revealing the dark interior of the bag, Ranger's excitement became more obvious. His tail was wagging steadily now, and he was making soft whining sounds that seemed more like encouragement than distress. Whatever scent had triggered his initial reaction was becoming stronger, more accessible, and his response was shifting from alert recognition to something approaching joy. Daniel stopped when the zipper was halfway open. Even with the partial opening, he could see the corner of something wrapped in what appeared to be a child's blanket. Small, colorful, with patterns that seemed wildly out of place in military equipment. But it was the smell that hit him first, faint but unmistakable after all these years. Carter's cologne mixed with desert sand and something else, something that brought back memories of children's voices and desperate circumstances and choices that had seemed impossible at the time. "There's a letter," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion as he spotted the corner of an envelope tucked beneath the wrapped bundle. "Carter wrote me a letter before he died, and I couldn't." "You never read it," Mrs. Patterson finished gently. Daniel shook his head. "I was afraid of what it might say, afraid it might blame me for not saving him, afraid it might tell me things I wasn't ready to hear." Tom Richardson leaned forward in his chair. "Son, in my experience, the letters we're most afraid to read are usually the ones we need to read the most." The wisdom in the older veteran's words resonated through the gymnasium. Several parents nodded in recognition. They had all had moments when difficult conversations or hard truths had been avoided until circumstances forced confrontation. Lucy was still standing beside Daniel's chair, her small hands still resting on his fingers. "My mommy says sometimes scary things turn out to be not scary at all," she offered. "They just look scary because we don't know what they are yet." The 5-year-old's philosophy struck Daniel as remarkably profound. Fear of the unknown had controlled his life for 20 years, had kept him isolated and haunted and unable to move forward. But surrounded by this unlikely collection of witnesses, police officers and teachers and children and fellow veterans, the unknown was beginning to feel less threatening and more like a possibility for something different. Daniel took a deep breath and pulled the zipper the rest of the way open. The contents of the bag seemed to glow in the gymnasium's fluorescent lighting, as if 20 years of darkness had made them sensitive to exposure. The first thing Daniel saw was indeed a child's blanket, small, knitted in bright yellows and blues, with tiny elephants dancing across the fabric. It was wrapped carefully around something that created a bundle no larger than a shoebox, and beneath it lay a sealed military envelope with "Danny" written across the front in Carter's familiar handwriting. Ranger's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The German shepherd's tail began wagging furiously, and he moved closer to the bag with an energy that suggested recognition rather than investigation. He sniffed delicately at the edge of the blanket, whined softly, and then looked up at Daniel with what could only be described as expectation. "He knows that scent," Officer Martinez said quietly, watching his partner's behavior with professional fascination. "That's not a threat response. That's a reunion response." Daniel's hands shook as he reached into the bag. The blanket was softer than he remembered, worn smooth by handling, but still carrying traces of the desert sand that seemed to infiltrate everything during deployment. As he lifted it carefully from the bag, he could feel the weight of whatever was wrapped inside. Substantial, but not heavy, important in a way that had nothing to do with physical mass. Mrs. Patterson had moved closer, her teacher's instincts overriding any remaining security concerns. "That's a beautiful blanket," she said softly. "It looks handmade." "It was," Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Made by someone who loved very much." The gymnasium had become a cathedral of silence, everyone present sensing they were witnessing something sacred being unveiled. Parents held their children a little closer, not from fear now, but from recognition that life could change in an instant, that some moments demanded witness and respect. Daniel began to unwrap the blanket slowly, his movements careful and reverent. As the fabric fell away, the contents were revealed. A small wooden toy truck, painted bright red but worn from handling. A military photograph showing 2 young soldiers standing beside a German shepherd in desert camouflage. A delicate silver bracelet with Arabic writing engraved on tiny plates, and a smartphone in a cracked protective case. But it was the photograph that stopped Daniel's breathing entirely. The image showed him, 20 years younger, wearing desert combat fatigues, his arm around Carter Williams, both of them grinning at the camera with the careless joy of young men who still believed they were invincible. Between them sat a magnificent German shepherd with intelligent dark eyes and alert ears. "That's King," Daniel said, pointing to the dog in the photograph. "Carter's canine partner." Ranger's response to seeing the photograph was extraordinary. He approached Daniel's chair and gently placed his front paws on the edge, stretching his neck to see the image more clearly. His whining took on a different quality, mournful, but somehow pleased, as if he was recognizing family in the faces looking back at him from the past. Military working dogs have incredible memories, Officer Martinez explained to the watching crowd. If Ranger ever worked with King or trained with him, he'd remember that scent for the rest of his life. Lucy, still standing beside Daniel's chair, pointed to the toy truck with curious eyes. "Is that somebody's toy?" Daniel nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "It belonged to a little boy we tried to save." The words opened a floodgate of memory that Daniel had kept carefully dammed for 20 years. Suddenly, he wasn't sitting in a bright gymnasium surrounded by American flags and children's artwork. He was back in Kandahar, Afghanistan, in the blazing heat of an October afternoon in 2005, when everything had changed forever. The transition was so complete, so overwhelming, that for a moment Daniel forgot where he was. The sounds of the gymnasium faded, replaced by the distant rumble of helicopters and the acrid smell of smoke that had defined those final days of deployment. His hands, still holding the photograph, began to tremble as the memories flooded back with devastating clarity. "Mr. Rhodes?" Mrs. Patterson's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Daniel blinked, forcing himself back to the present, but the past refused to release its grip entirely. "I need to tell you what happened," he said, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. "I need to tell you about Carter and King and the children we couldn't save." Tom Richardson leaned forward in his chair. Sometimes telling the story is the only way to let it go. Daniel looked around the gymnasium at all the faces watching him. Some young, some old, all patient and willing to listen. These strangers had become accidental witnesses to his most private pain, and somehow their presence felt like exactly what he'd needed for 20 years without knowing it. "It was October 15th, 2005, Daniel began, and as the words left his mouth, the gymnasium around him seemed to fade into the background. We'd been deployed for 11 months, and we were scheduled to rotate home in 2 weeks. Carter and King were part of our patrol unit, responsible for explosive detection and search and rescue operations." The memory was so vivid that Daniel could taste the dust in the air, could feel the weight of his gear and the constant alertness that came with operating in hostile territory. Carter had been the youngest member of their unit, barely 19 years old, with a baby face that made him look even younger, and an optimism that somehow hadn't been worn down by months of deployment. "We got word that morning about a bombing in a village about 15 kilometers from our base," Daniel continued. "An improvised explosive device had detonated near a school. There were casualties, and some of the children were missing. Our unit was assigned to search and rescue. When we arrived at the village," Daniel said, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone recounting events that had been replayed countless times in nightmares, the scene was chaos. Buildings damaged, people screaming, children crying. The local authorities thought 3 kids were trapped in a collapsed house, but they couldn't pinpoint the location. Mrs. Patterson had taken a seat in the chair beside Daniel, her teacher's instincts recognizing someone who needed support while sharing a difficult truth. "That's where Carter and King came in?" Daniel nodded. King was incredible at search and rescue. He could detect human scent through debris that would fool any technological equipment we had. Carter sent him into the wreckage, and within minutes, King had located the children. The memory of that moment was crystal clear. King's urgent barking, his precise movements as he indicated the location of trapped survivors, Carter's immediate response as he began organizing the rescue effort. Everything had been going according to training, according to plan, according to the way things were supposed to work when good people did dangerous jobs for the right reasons. "We found 2 children first," Daniel continued. "A girl, maybe 7 years old, and her baby brother. The girl was unconscious but alive. The baby was crying, which was actually a good sign, meant his lungs were clear. But there was supposed to be a 3rd child." Daniel's hands tightened on the photograph as the memory reached the part he'd been avoiding for 20 years. The building was unstable. Command was telling us to evacuate, to wait for engineering support before going deeper into the structure. But Carter could hear something, some sound that the rest of us were missing. Ranger had positioned himself directly beside Daniel's chair, his presence somehow comforting in a way that reminded Daniel of King's steady reliability during those chaotic deployment months. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone in the gymnasium, past and present connecting through the shared language of service and loyalty. "Carter insisted there was another child deeper in the building," Daniel said. King was agitated, kept returning to a specific area where the ceiling had partially collapsed. Carter was convinced they were detecting someone else, someone who needed help. The silence in the gymnasium was complete now, everyone present understanding they were hearing about life and death decisions made under impossible circumstances. Parents instinctively held their children closer, imagining themselves in the position of the Afghan families whose world had been shattered by violence. "I was the ranking officer," Daniel continued, and these words carried the weight of 20 years of guilt. "The decision was mine. I could have ordered Carter to evacuate with the 2 children we'd already rescued. I could have followed protocol and waited for additional support." Lucy, still standing beside his chair, seemed to sense the importance of what Daniel was saying. "But you didn't," she said softly. "No," Daniel replied. "I didn't. I gave Carter permission to go deeper into the building. I let him take King and search for the 3rd child." The memory of that decision was like a physical weight in Daniel's chest. He could still see Carter's face when he'd given the authorization. Relief and determination mixed with the kind of focused intensity that came with knowing lives hung in the balance. "They found him," Daniel said. "A little boy, maybe 4 years old, trapped under a beam but alive. Carter managed to get him free, and King guided them toward the exit. Everything was working. Everything was going according to plan." But Daniel's voice was already beginning to change, taking on the hollow quality that came with approaching the part of the story that had no happy ending. "The building collapsed as they were coming out," he said simply. "A secondary explosion, maybe a gas line, maybe ordnance we hadn't detected. The entire structure came down in about 10 seconds. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Everyone in the gymnasium understood what was coming next, but understanding didn't make it easier to hear. "Carter threw the little boy toward the exit just before the collapse," Daniel continued. "King was right beside him, trying to shield them both. I was outside, coordinating with the medical team, when I heard the rumble." Daniel's voice broke slightly, the first crack in his composure since he'd begun telling the story. "By the time we dug them out, Carter was gone. King was badly injured but alive. The little boy died in my arms 20 minutes later." The silence that followed was profound, weighted with the kind of grief that transcends personal experience and becomes universal. Mrs. Patterson had tears streaming down her face, and several parents in the audience were openly crying. Even the children seemed to understand that something terrible and important had happened, something that explained the sadness they'd sensed in Daniel from the moment he'd walked into their gymnasium. "The girl and baby that we rescued first," Daniel said quietly, "they survived. They were evacuated to a hospital in Germany and eventually reunited with family members. But Carter and the little boy..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Tom Richardson spoke into the silence. "You saved 2 lives that day." "Carter saved them," Daniel corrected firmly. "Carter and King saved them. I just gave the order that got Carter killed." "You gave the order that gave those children a chance," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "You made the choice that someone in your position had to make." Daniel looked down at the items spread before him. The photograph, the toy truck, the bracelet, the phone. "These belonged to the little boy," he said, "the one who died. His name was Amir. The truck was his favorite toy. The bracelet belonged to his sister, the girl we saved. She'd given it to him for protection." The connections were beginning to make sense to everyone watching. This wasn't just the story of a soldier carrying guilt. It was the story of a man who had spent 20 years carrying the physical remnants of a choice that had saved some lives while costing others. "The phone belonged to Carter," Daniel continued. "It has the last pictures he took, the last messages he sent. I've never looked at them." Ranger had moved closer to the scattered items, his nose working carefully over each object. When he reached the photograph, he gently nuzzled it with his snout, then looked up at Daniel with an expression that seemed to convey understanding. "King survived the collapse," Daniel said, "but his injuries were severe. He was retired from active duty and eventually adopted by a family in the States. I lost track of him after that." Officer Martinez had been listening to the story with the intense focus of someone who understood the bonds between handlers and their canine partners. "Mr. Rhodes," he said carefully, "what was King's full designation?" Daniel looked up, confused by the question. His military designation? King was his call name, but his full registered name was Koenig's Ranger of the Mountain Division. The words hit Officer Martinez like lightning. He looked down at his own partner, then back at Daniel with an expression of amazement. Mr. Rhodes, my partner's full name is Ranger. He's a second-generation military working dog. His sire was a German shepherd named Koenig, who was retired from service in 2006. The implication hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Everyone in the gymnasium was doing the same calculation, reaching the same impossible conclusion. Ranger wasn't just detecting familiar scents from Daniel's bag, he was detecting the scent of his own father. But that revelation would have to wait, because Daniel was reaching for Carter's letter with hands that shook like leaves in a hurricane. Could Ranger really be the son of King, the canine partner who died trying to save Carter and little Amir? And what secrets has Carter been keeping in that letter for 20 years? The revelation about Ranger's possible connection to King hung in the air like a bridge between past and present, but Daniel's attention was entirely focused on the sealed envelope in his trembling hands. The paper was military issue, slightly yellowed with age, and Carter's handwriting across the front, Danny, in blue ink, looked as fresh as if it had been written yesterday rather than 2 decades ago. Officer Martinez was studying his canine partner with new understanding, watching as Ranger continued to show behaviors that suggested deep recognition rather than simple detection. "The timeline matches perfectly," he said quietly to Principal Walker. King was retired in 2006 due to injuries sustained in the line of duty. The breeding program would have used his genetics immediately. Military working dogs with his service record and temperament are incredibly valuable for future generations. But the administrative details faded into background noise as Daniel's fingers found the edge of the envelope's seal. For 20 years, this letter had represented everything he couldn't face about Carter's death, about his own role in the decisions that led to tragedy, about the weight of command and the cost of trying to save lives in an impossible situation. Mrs. Patterson reached over and gently placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You don't have to read it alone," she said softly. "We're all here with you." The offer of support from a room full of strangers should have felt invasive, but instead it provided exactly the strength Daniel needed to break the seal that had protected Carter's final words for 2 decades. The paper tore with a soft whisper, and Daniel carefully extracted a single sheet of military stationery covered with Carter's familiar handwriting. "Would you like me to read it?" Mrs. Patterson offered, recognizing the magnitude of the moment for someone who had carried this burden alone for so long. Daniel shook his head. "No, I need to hear his voice again, even if it's just in my head." He unfolded the letter carefully, his eyes scanning Carter's neat handwriting before focusing on the date at the top, October 14th, 2005. The day before the mission that changed everything. Carter had written this letter on what would turn out to be his last night alive, and somehow he'd known it was important enough to put his thoughts on paper. Daniel cleared his throat and began to read aloud, his voice carrying Carter's words across the silent gymnasium. "Danny, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you're probably blaming yourself for whatever decision led to it. I know you well enough to know that's exactly what you're doing right now, so I'm going to tell you some things you need to hear." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Even from beyond the grave, Carter had understood exactly how guilt would consume him, had anticipated the self-recrimination that would define the next 20 years of his life. "First," Daniel continued reading, "whatever happened was not your fault. You are the best officer I've ever served under, and every decision you make comes from wanting to protect people and save lives. If I'm gone, it's because I chose to follow orders that were given for the right reasons, even if they led to the wrong outcome." Tears were streaming down Daniel's face now, but his voice remained steady as he continued sharing Carter's words with the unexpected congregation that had gathered to witness this moment of revelation. "Second, I need you to know about the children we've been trying to help here. There's something I haven't told you about the little girl from yesterday's rescue, the one who gave her brother the protection bracelet. Her name isn't just Amira like we thought. Her full name is Layla Amira Hassan, and she has family in the United States." Daniel stopped reading, his eyes scanning ahead to make sure he was understanding correctly. "Carter knew something about the girl we rescued," he said to the listening crowd, "something he hadn't told me." Mrs. Patterson leaned closer. "What did he know?" Daniel returned to the letter, his voice growing stronger as Carter's words revealed information that had been hidden for 20 years. "Danny, Layla's uncle lives in Michigan. He's been trying to get immigration paperwork processed to bring his niece and nephew to safety, but the bureaucracy moves slowly and the situation here is getting worse every day. I've been working with the Red Cross and some civilian contractors to try to expedite the process, but I didn't want to get your hopes up until I knew it would work out." The implications of Carter's words were staggering. The girl they had rescued wasn't just a random victim of violence. She was someone with family connections to the United States, someone who Carter had been quietly working to save through official channels, even as they conducted dangerous rescue missions in the field. "There's more," Daniel said, his eyes moving down the page. Carter writes, "If something happens to me, there's a phone number in my personal effects. It belongs to Mahmoud Hassan in Dearborn, Michigan. He's Layla's uncle, and he needs to know that his niece survived. He also needs to know about little Amir, whether we can save him or not." Ranger had moved closer to Daniel's chair and was now sitting directly beside him, his attention focused intently on the letter, as if he could understand the significance of the words being shared. His presence felt like a connection to King, to Carter, to all the bonds that had been forged and broken during those impossible months of deployment. Daniel's hands shook as he continued reading. "Danny, I know you'll want to carry the weight of whatever happens, but I need you to promise me something. If Layla survives, if she makes it to her uncle in Michigan, I need you to find her someday. Not to apologize or to carry guilt, but to see that something good came from all of this. She needs to know that people cared enough to risk everything to save her." The words were like a roadmap Daniel had never known existed, a path forward that Carter had tried to provide, even knowing he might not be alive to share it. For 20 years, Daniel had carried the guilt of failure, but Carter's letter was revealing a different perspective, a plan for connection and healing that had been waiting patiently for someone to discover it. "There's one more page," Daniel said, turning the letter over to continue reading Carter's final message. "I know this is a lot to ask, especially if things have gone wrong and you're dealing with loss and guilt and all the things that happen when good people try to do impossible jobs. But King and I believe that saving lives isn't just about the moment of rescue. It's about what happens afterward, about the connections that get made and the healing that becomes possible when people refuse to let tragedy have the final word." Mrs. Patterson was crying openly now, as were several other adults in the gymnasium. Even the children seemed to sense the profound emotion in Carter's words, the way he had tried to reach across time and death to provide comfort and direction to the friend he knew would be struggling with survivor's guilt. Daniel's voice broke slightly as he read the final paragraph. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home to see my little sister graduate from high school or to meet the nieces and nephews I'll never have. But it also means you did survive, which was always more important to me than my own safety. You have work left to do, Danny. You have connections to make and healing to facilitate and stories to tell that will help other people understand that even in the darkest situations, there are reasons to keep fighting for what's right." The letter was signed simply, "Your friend always, Carter Williams. P.S. Give King an extra treat for me and tell him he's the best partner anyone could ask for." The silence that followed was profound, weighted with the recognition that everyone present had just witnessed something extraordinary, the revelation of a friendship that transcended death, a plan for healing that had been waiting 20 years to be discovered, and the beginning of connections that none of them had known were possible. But it was Lucy who broke the silence with a question that cut straight to the heart of everything. "Mr. Daniel, did you ever find Layla?" The question hung in the air like a challenge and an opportunity combined. Daniel looked around the gymnasium at all the faces watching him, at Mrs. Patterson, whose tears reflected his own, at Ranger, whose presence seemed to connect past and present in ways that defied explanation. "No," Daniel said quietly. "I never tried to find her. I was too afraid that learning about her life would make my guilt worse, that seeing her would remind me of everything we couldn't save." "But what if it made you feel better instead?" Lucy asked with the straightforward logic that only children possess. "What if Layla wants to thank you for saving her?" The possibility had never occurred to Daniel in 20 years of carrying guilt and regret. He had been so focused on his failures, so consumed by the weight of the lives that were lost, that he had never considered Carter's final request as an opportunity for healing rather than additional pain. Mrs. Patterson was studying Daniel's face with the focused attention of someone who had spent years helping people work through difficult realizations. "Mr. Rhodes, what was the uncle's name, the one in Michigan?" Daniel looked back at the letter. "Mahmoud Hassan, Dearborn, Michigan." "That's not very far from here," she said thoughtfully. "Dearborn has a large Middle Eastern community. If Layla was successfully relocated there as a child, there's a good chance she's still in the area. The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. After 20 years of imagining Layla as a permanent reminder of his failures, the idea that she might be living a real life, maybe even a good life, somewhere within driving distance seemed almost too wonderful to believe. Officer Martinez had been listening to the conversation while watching his canine partner's continued fascination with the items from Daniel's bag. "Mr. Rhodes, I have a colleague in the Dearborn Police Department. If you're serious about trying to locate Layla, we might be able to help through official channels." "What if she doesn't want to be found?" Daniel asked, voicing the fear that had kept him from searching for 20 years. "What if seeing me just brings back traumatic memories she's spent her whole life trying to forget?" Tom Richardson leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face showing the understanding that came from his own decades of processing war experiences. "Son, there's only one way to find out. And after hearing that letter, I think Carter would want you to take that chance." Ranger had risen from his sitting position and was now gently nuzzling the photograph that showed Carter, Daniel, and King together in happier times. His behavior suggested not just recognition, but something approaching reverence, as if he understood the significance of the connection being revealed. "There's something else," Daniel said, looking down at Carter's phone for the first time in 20 years. Carter mentioned that his phone has pictures and messages. Maybe there's more information about Layla, about her uncle, about the arrangements Carter was trying to make. Mrs. Patterson nodded encouragingly. "It's worth checking. Even if the phone doesn't work anymore, there might be ways to recover the data." "I might be able to help with that," said a voice from the back of the gymnasium. Everyone turned to see a man in his 30s approaching, wearing the kind of casual clothes that suggested he was a parent rather than the school staff. "I'm Jake Morrison, Lucy's dad. I work in IT recovery. If there's data on that phone, I can probably retrieve it." Lucy's face lit up with pride. "My daddy fixes broken computers." The offer of technical assistance felt like another piece of Carter's plan falling into place, another connection being made that would help fulfill his final request. Daniel looked around the gymnasium at all the people who had somehow become part of this story. Teachers and police officers, parents and children, fellow veterans and complete strangers who had chosen to stay and witness something they couldn't have anticipated when they'd come to a simple school ceremony. "I think," Daniel said slowly, "Carter would have liked all of you. He believed in connections, in people helping each other, in the idea that good things could come from the worst situations." Ranger had positioned himself so that he was touching both Daniel's leg and the photograph simultaneously, creating a physical connection between past and present that seemed to embody everything Carter had written about in his letter. The sight of this remarkable dog, possibly the son of Carter's beloved King, choosing to bridge the gap between memory and reality, felt like a sign that healing was not only possible, but already beginning. But as Daniel prepared to hand Carter's phone to Jake Morrison for data recovery, he had no idea that the biggest revelation was still to come, and that it was sitting in the audience, watching everything unfold with eyes that held recognition, but hadn't yet found the courage to speak. If Layla really is living in Michigan, what are the chances she might have seen the news about today's ceremony and be watching this very moment unfold? As Jake Morrison approached with his offer to recover data from Carter's phone, a commotion near the gymnasium's entrance caught everyone's attention. The local news crew that had been filming the ceremony from the back of the room was suddenly focused on something happening outside. Their camera operator was gesturing urgently toward the parking lot, and through the tall windows, everyone could see additional vehicles arriving. "Excuse me," called out Sarah Chen, the news reporter who had been quietly documenting the Veterans Day ceremony. "We're getting reports that this story is already going viral on social media. Someone live-streamed parts of your reading of the letter, and it's being shared across multiple platforms." Mrs. Patterson looked confused. "How is that possible? We didn't authorize any live streaming." "Parent in the back row," Sarah explained, pointing toward the far corner of the gymnasium. She was filming her daughter's presentation and accidentally caught the entire situation with the K9 unit and the bag opening. The video has been shared over 50,000 times in the past hour. Daniel felt a wave of panic wash over him. For 20 years, he had kept his story private, had avoided any situation that might expose his carefully guarded secrets. The idea that his most vulnerable moment was now being viewed by strangers across the internet felt like a violation of everything he had tried to protect. "I can have our legal team contact the platforms," Principal Walker offered quickly. We can request that the video be taken down." "No," said a voice from the middle of the gymnasium. Everyone turned to see who had spoken, and found a woman in her late 20s standing slowly from her seat in the third row. She had dark hair and olive skin, and her eyes held a mixture of shock and recognition that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. "Don't take the video down," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Please." Mrs. Patterson approached the woman carefully. "Ma'am, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." The woman's eyes were fixed entirely on Daniel, scanning his face with the intensity of someone trying to confirm an impossible possibility. "What was the little girl's name?" she asked quietly. "The one you rescued. The one whose brother—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Daniel's heart began pounding as he recognized something familiar in the woman's features. Something that reminded him of a frightened child's face, glimpsed briefly in the chaos of a rescue mission 20 years ago. "Layla," he whispered. Her name was Layla Amira Hassan. The woman's hand flew to her mouth, and tears began streaming down her face. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Oh my God, it's really you." The gymnasium erupted in whispers and gasps as everyone present began to understand what was happening. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was the reunion that Carter had requested in his letter, the connection he had hoped Daniel would someday make, happening in the most unexpected way possible. "You're Layla," Daniel said, and it wasn't a question. Even though she was now a grown woman, there was something unmistakable in her eyes, something that connected her to the frightened 7-year-old he had carried from the rubble 20 years ago. She nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Around them, the entire gymnasium had fallen into stunned silence, as people recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary, a reunion between a rescuer and the person he had saved, facilitated by a chain of events that seemed too remarkable to be coincidence. Mrs. Patterson looked between Daniel and Layla with amazement. "You live here, in this community?" "I'm a teacher," Layla managed to say through her emotions. "Third grade at Roosevelt Elementary, about 10 miles from here. I came today because—" She paused, struggling to find words for something that defied explanation. "Because I try to attend Veterans Day ceremonies whenever I can, to honor the soldiers who saved my life." The pieces were falling into place with stunning symmetry. Layla hadn't just survived her childhood trauma and immigration to the United States. She had become an educator, someone who spent her life nurturing and protecting children the way she had once needed protection herself. "Your uncle," Daniel said, remembering Carter's letter. "Mahmoud Hassan in Dearborn?" "He raised me," Layla confirmed. "After you rescued me, it took 8 months for the immigration paperwork to be processed, but Uncle Mahmoud never gave up. He said American soldiers had saved his niece, and he was going to make sure I got the chance to live the life they had fought to protect." Ranger had risen from his position beside Daniel's chair and was now approaching Layla with the same gentle curiosity he had shown earlier. But as he got closer, his behavior changed dramatically. His tail began wagging furiously, and he made soft whining sounds that seemed to express recognition rather than investigation. "He knows you," Officer Martinez observed with amazement. "That's impossible unless—" He stopped, working through the implications of what he was seeing. Layla knelt down as Ranger approached, and when the German Shepherd reached her, he immediately began nuzzling her hand with the kind of affectionate familiarity usually reserved for family members. Layla's reaction was equally dramatic. She gasped and looked up at Daniel with wide eyes. "King," she whispered. "This dog reminds me of King." The connection hit everyone simultaneously. Ranger wasn't just recognizing a scent from his father's memory. He was recognizing someone King had known and protected during those final days in Afghanistan. Military working dogs formed powerful bonds with the people they were assigned to protect, and somehow that protective instinct had been passed down through genetics and training to the next generation. "Ranger is King's son," Daniel explained, his voice filled with wonder at the impossibility of what was happening. "King was Carter's canine partner. He was injured in the same collapse that killed Carter and Amir," Layla finished quietly. "I remember him. King stayed with me after you pulled me from the building. He wouldn't leave my side until the medical helicopter arrived." The gymnasium had become a cathedral of silence, as everyone present recognized they were witnessing something that transcended normal human experience. This wasn't just a reunion, It was the culmination of connections that had been set in motion 20 years ago and had somehow found their way back together through a combination of courage, coincidence, and the remarkable loyalty of military working dogs. Lucy had approached Layla and Ranger quietly, her 5-year-old curiosity overcoming any adult hesitation about interfering in such a profound moment. "Are you the little girl from the story?" she asked, with characteristic directness. Layla smiled through her tears and nodded. "I was a little girl like you when Mr. Daniel saved my life." "And now you're a teacher like Mrs. Patterson?" "Yes, I am." Lucy considered this information with the serious expression that children wear when processing something important. "So, getting saved made you want to save other kids by teaching them?" The simplicity of Lucy's observation cut straight to the heart of something Layla had probably never articulated so clearly. "Yes," she said softly. "I think it did." Daniel had been watching this exchange with growing amazement, but now he found himself standing and approaching Layla slowly, as if she might disappear if he moved too quickly. "I need to tell you something," he said when he reached her. "I need to tell you about the guilt I've carried for 20 years. Layla looked up at him with eyes that held no anger, no recrimination, only the patient attention of someone prepared to listen to a difficult truth. "What guilt?" "I gave the order that sent Carter and King into that building," Daniel said. "I made the decision that got Carter killed. If I had followed protocol, if I had waited for engineering support, Carter would still be alive." The confession that had eaten at Daniel for 2 decades hung in the air between them. But instead of the anger or blame he had expected, Layla's response was something he had never considered possible. "Mr. Daniel," she said gently, "Carter's decision to go into that building saved Amir's life for those final 20 minutes. It gave my little brother the chance to know he was loved and protected, even at the end. And it saved my life completely." She paused, reaching out to take Daniel's weathered hands in her own. "But more than that, Carter's sacrifice and your decision to honor his memory by carrying these items, it brought us together today. It brought Ranger to us. It created this moment where healing became possible." Mrs. Patterson was crying openly now, as were most of the adults in the gymnasium. Even the children seemed to understand they were witnessing something sacred, forgiveness being offered and received, connections being restored across time and trauma. "There's something else," Layla continued, releasing Daniel's hands to reach into her purse. "Something I've carried with me every day since I was 7 years old." She pulled out a small silver bracelet, identical to the one in Daniel's bag but polished bright from years of wear. "Amir's protection bracelet, the one I gave him before the bombing. When the medical team was treating me at the hospital, they gave it back to me. They said it was found clutched in his hand." Daniel looked from the bracelet Layla wore to the one still lying among Carter's belongings, understanding dawning on his face. "You've been carrying a piece of him too." Jake Morrison had been watching the reunion with the same amazed attention as everyone else, but now he stepped forward with Carter's phone in his hands. "I hate to interrupt," he said quietly, "but I was able to get the phone working long enough to recover some of the data. There are messages here that I think you both need to see." Daniel and Layla moved closer as Jake powered up the device and navigated to Carter's text messages. The most recent conversation was with someone identified simply as Uncle M and dated October 14th, 2005, the same day Carter had written his final letter. "He was texting with your uncle," Daniel said, reading the conversation thread with growing amazement. The messages revealed the full extent of Carter's behind-the-scenes efforts to help Layla and Amir reach safety in the United States. He had been coordinating with Mahmoud Hassan for weeks, providing updates on the children's condition, sharing photographs to confirm their identities, and working through military channels to expedite their immigration paperwork. But it was the final message that left everyone speechless. Sent at 11:47 p.m. on October 14th, just hours before the mission that would cost Carter his life, it read, "Uncle M, tomorrow we attempt rescue of trapped children. If something happens to me, tell Layla her soldier friend will always watch over her. Tell her someday she'll meet the officer who gave me permission to be a hero. His name is Daniel Rhodes, and he carries more love than guilt, even if he doesn't know it yet." The message revealed that Carter had not only anticipated the possibility of his own death, but had specifically wanted Layla to know Daniel's name, had wanted her to understand that his sacrifice came from a place of love rather than obligation. He knew, Layla whispered, staring at the phone screen. "He knew you would blame yourself, and he wanted me to find you someday." Daniel was beyond words. For 20 years, he had carried guilt that Carter had apparently never wanted him to feel. The young soldier had gone into that building, not because of a commanding officer's decision, but because of his own choice to follow through on a promise he had made to a frightened little girl and her baby brother. Ranger had positioned himself between Daniel and Layla, as if he understood his role as a bridge between past and present, between King's memory and the ongoing connections that made healing possible. His presence seemed to complete a circle that had been broken 20 years ago. "What happens now?" Mrs. Patterson asked quietly. Daniel looked around the gymnasium at all the faces watching him. Lucy with her innocent wisdom, Mrs. Patterson with her teacher's heart, Officer Martinez with his understanding of service bonds, Tom Richardson with his veteran's perspective, and Layla with her survivor's strength. "Now," Daniel said, his voice stronger than it had been in years, "I stop carrying guilt and start carrying gratitude for Carter's friendship, for the connections we've discovered, for the reminder that even in the darkest situations, love finds a way to create something meaningful." But the greatest surprise was still to come, because Layla had one more revelation that would transform everything. What could Layla possibly reveal that would be even more shocking than this incredible reunion? Layla reached into her purse again, this time pulling out a manila folder that looked official and well-handled. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing what appeared to be legal documents and photographs. "Mr. Daniel," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of nervous excitement and profound emotion, "there's something else Carter's sacrifice made possible, something I've been working toward for the past 5 years." Daniel watched as she carefully extracted a photograph from the folder. When she turned it toward him, his breath caught in his throat. The image showed Layla standing beside a young man in military dress uniform, both of them smiling broadly at the camera. But it was the name tape on the uniform that made Daniel's knees nearly buckle. Williams. "This is my son," Layla said quietly. "Carter James Williams Hassan. I named him after the soldier who died trying to save my brother." The gymnasium erupted in gasps and whispers as the implications of her words sank in. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth, and several parents began crying openly as they understood the profound tribute Layla had created through her son's name. "He's 21 years old," Layla continued, her voice growing stronger with pride. "He just graduated from West Point last month. He specifically requested to serve with K-9 units because I told him stories about King and Carter and the soldiers who saved his mother's life." Daniel stared at the photograph, seeing Carter's namesake wearing the same uniform Carter had died in, carrying on a legacy of service that bridged continents and generations. "He's a soldier," Daniel whispered. "More than that," Layla said, pulling out another document. "He's been assigned to the same unit Carter served with, the Econ Airborne Division. His commanding officer is Colonel Rebecca Martinez, Officer Martinez's sister." Officer Martinez looked stunned. Rebecca never mentioned— Wait. He pulled out his phone and quickly scrolled through recent messages. "She texted me this morning about a new K-9 handler joining her unit. Said he had an interesting backstory about his mother being rescued by American soldiers in Afghanistan." The connections were becoming almost impossible to believe. Carter's sacrifice had not only saved Layla's life, but had inspired her to raise a son who would follow in his footsteps, serving with the same division, working with military dogs, and carrying Carter's name into a new generation of service. "There's more," Layla said, her eyes beginning to shine with tears of joy rather than sadness. "Carter is coming home on leave next week. He's been planning to visit all the Veterans Day ceremonies in Michigan, hoping to find someone who might have known the original Carter Williams. He has no idea that I found you first." Lucy had been listening to this revelation with the rapt attention that children give to the best stories, and now she spoke up with typical 5-year-old directness. "So, the baby soldier who died made it so there could be a new soldier with his name." "Yes," Layla said, smiling through her tears. "That's exactly what happened." Daniel felt something shifting inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of guilt he had carried for 20 years. Carter's death hadn't been meaningless. It had created a ripple effect of connections and healing that had touched multiple generations. The young soldier's sacrifice had saved Layla's life, inspired her to become an educator, motivated her to raise a son who would serve others, and ultimately brought them all together in this impossible moment of reunion. "I need to tell you something else," Daniel said, his voice steady for the first time all day. "Something I've never told anyone, not even myself, until right now." He looked around the gymnasium at all the faces watching him, people who had started as strangers but had become witnesses to something extraordinary. "For 20 years, I convinced myself that I was carrying Carter's belongings out of guilt and penance. But listening to his letter, seeing you grown up and successful, learning about your son, I realized I wasn't carrying guilt at all." "What were you carrying?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently. "Love," Daniel said simply. "I was carrying love for a friend who died too young, love for the children he tried to save, love for the connections he believed were possible, even in the darkest circumstances. The guilt was just fear disguised as responsibility." Ranger had moved to the center of the circle that had formed around Daniel and Layla, and was now sitting at attention as if he understood the significance of what was happening. His presence seemed to represent all the bonds that connected them, past to present, loss to healing, sacrifice to hope. Tom Richardson stood up from his chair, his weathered face showing the kind of emotion that came from recognizing truth when he heard it. "Son, that's the most profound thing I have heard in 40 years of trying to make sense of war and loss and why good people suffer." Principal Walker approached the group with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Rhodes, Ms. Hassan, I think we need to change the focus of today's ceremony. This story, this reunion, this connection, it's what Veterans Day is really about. It's about remembering that service and sacrifice create bonds that transcend time and tragedy." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement from everyone present. What had begun as a standard school ceremony had become something unprecedented, a living demonstration of how military service created connections that could heal wounds across decades. Sarah Chen, the news reporter who had been documenting everything, approached with her camera crew. "Would you be willing to share this story more widely? The original video is already being shared internationally, and I think people need to hear the complete story about Carter's letter, about Layla's son, about the connections that made this reunion possible." Daniel looked at Layla, seeking her permission to make their private reunion into something more public. She nodded enthusiastically. Carter wanted people to understand that good things could come from terrible situations. "I think he would want this story told." "But," Layla added with a smile that lit up her entire face, "I want to wait until my son gets here next week. I want him to meet you in person, Mr. Daniel. I want him to shake hands with the officer who gave his namesake permission to be a hero." The gymnasium erupted in applause as people realized they would be witnessing not just one reunion, but two. The meeting between Daniel and Carter's namesake, the young soldier who carried on his legacy of service and sacrifice. Mrs. Patterson was already making plans. "We'll organize a special assembly next week. We'll invite the whole community." This is the kind of story that can change how people think about military service, about the connections between strangers, about the way love persists even after loss. Jake Morrison held up Carter's phone, which was still displaying the recovered messages. "There's one more text here," he said. "It's from your uncle, sent about an hour after Carter's final message." Layla looked at the screen and read aloud, "Carter, thank you for caring about my niece and nephew like they were your own family. If something happens to you, I promise to raise Layla to understand that American soldiers are not strangers, but brothers and sisters who risk everything for people they've never met. She will know your name and carry your memory." The promise Mahmoud Hassan had made 23 years ago had been kept in ways he could never have imagined. Layla had not only remembered Carter's name, but had given it to her son, had built her career around nurturing children the way she had been nurtured, and had spent 2 decades looking for the soldiers who had saved her life. Daniel reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the drawing Lucy had given him at the beginning of the ceremony. The crayon artwork showed a soldier keeping children safe, and now he understood that Lucy's innocent artistry had captured something profound about the purpose of military service. "Lucy," he said, approaching the little girl who had started this entire revelation with her fearless curiosity, "you drew this picture for me this morning, and it's perfect, but I want to add something to it." He knelt down beside her and pointed to the soldier in the drawing. "This soldier's name is Carter, and this little girl he's protecting grows up to become a teacher like Mrs. Patterson. And she has a son who becomes a soldier too. The picture doesn't end with the rescue. It continues with all the good things that happen because people care about each other." Lucy studied her artwork with new understanding. So, it's not just a picture about being brave. It's a picture about love making more love. Exactly, Daniel said, feeling lighter than he had in 20 years. It's about love making more love. Ranger had approached Lucy and was now sitting beside her, his tail wagging as she petted his head. The sight of the little girl, the military working dog, and the recovered artifacts created a tableau that seemed to represent everything Carter had written about in his letter, the connections between past and present, the healing that became possible when people refused to let tragedy have the final word. As the ceremony began to wind down and families started making plans to return next week for the expanded reunion, Daniel realized that his 20-year journey of carrying guilt and secrets had transformed into something entirely different. He was now part of a community, connected to people who understood that military service wasn't just about individual heroism, but about the networks of care and protection that extended across time and geography. Mrs. Patterson approached him with a gentle smile. "Mr. Rhodes, I have a feeling that next week's ceremony is going to be unlike anything our school has ever hosted." "I think Carter would have loved that," Daniel replied, looking down at the items that were no longer his burden to carry alone. He always believed that the best stories were the ones that brought people together. As families began to leave the gymnasium, making plans to return for the expanded ceremony, Daniel felt a profound sense of completion. The bag that had represented 20 years of isolation and guilt was now the centerpiece of connections that stretched from Afghanistan to Michigan, from 2005 to 25, from loss to love to hope. But perhaps most importantly, he was no longer carrying his memories alone. He was part of a community that included Layla and her son Carter, Mrs. Patterson and her students, Officer Martinez and Ranger, and dozens of other people who had chosen to witness and support this moment of healing. Sometimes, Daniel thought, as he carefully repacked Carter's belongings for the journey home, it takes a dog to remind us how human we really are. And sometimes it takes 20 years of carrying love disguised as guilt, before we understand that the heaviest burdens often contain the greatest gifts. The story that had begun with a canine's growl at a mysterious bag had become a testament to the power of connection, the persistence of love, and the way military service creates bonds that transcend time, distance, and even death itself. As Daniel walked out of Jefferson Elementary School, no longer alone with his secrets, he knew that Carter Williams would have been proud of the story they had all written together. And next week, when young Carter James Williams Hassan arrived to meet the officer who had given his namesake permission to be a hero, the circle of connection would finally be complete. Thank you for listening to this incredible story of love, loss, and the connections that bind us all together. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear how this story touched your heart and what it means to have heroes like Carter Williams protecting us all.